something special about our various expressions of worship, the gospel and sacred music and other art forms. Through these we access our God and enjoy that comforting, peaceful feeling that defines our spiritual engagement. For the past 30 years in Barbados, One Festival has sought to provide the platform for Barbadians to share in the joys of the Lord through these expressions. And so, in celebration of the 30th anniversary of Barbados Gospel Fest, we present this series, Touching Lives, Changing Nations. Now, as you are aware, the gospel experience in Barbados predates the festival. Therefore, we have stepped back a few decades to a period that is often regarded by many as exciting times for these expressions of gospel. Former director of the Barbados Gospel Fest Mass Choir, Shelton Perkins, places things in their correct perspective.
The 70s into the 80s, there was a lot of activity. That was when choirs were becoming popular and gospel music was, becoming something that people look forward to outside of church. So you had a lot of concerts happening and a lot of activity in that regard during the late 70s into the 80s. And then the 80s, to me, was one of the most explosive times for gospel music, as far as I can remember, because there used to be concerts almost every Saturday, and more than one. And you always had a concert to attend. The Nazarene Tabernacle in Eagle Hall was the place, the place to be. And they used to have some in Queen's Park as well. I remember too that there was a competition as well in singing. I think it was organized by Angela Spring. I remember her name. I can't remember what it was called, but it used to be a competition for soloists mainly, right? And that used to happen in Queen's Park. And that showed up people like Sheldon Hope. Sheldon Hope came out of that competition. I remember that distinctly. He's a little, probably 11-year-old boy singing, So he came through that competition. Before that, Youth for Christ was the thing to attend in the 60s into the 70s, right? And that was popular for the young people. It was a movement pitched at the youth, and that was in the 60s, mainly into the 70s. And they had what you call rallies every Saturday night. Most of them used to be at the First Baptist Church because that was the biggest church to have them. And that church used to be full. And that's where young people used to have their outlet, so to speak. And they used to engage in things like quizzes. Most of it was competitive too. Quizzes and singing competitions. So they had an annual rally every year because there were branches in other parishes, St. George, Christ Church, they had Spicetown, I believe. So they would come together and compete. So you had what they call jump quizzes. So you used to answer and to jump to give your answer, and then they would have trio competitions, choral competitions, and choir. So that used to be a good outlet for young people at the time. Then you started having, a lot of musical activity, a lot of choirs and singing and so. So you would have a concert that would have United Holy Church of America District Choir, you would have the New Testament Mass Choir, the New Testament Soul Children, all these were big choirs. Abundant Life Assembly Choir, these were choirs that had some, pushing towards 100, right? The choirs were Black American influenced, right? So a lot of these songs were, along that genre. But it was mainly a mixture of what we call traditional gospel music. There were bands also who, these bands started, to have the more Caribbean type rhythms and so. A lot of it wasn't too well received in the early stages, but after time, people grew, which was interesting because in churches, and mostly Pentecostal churches, the beat was really soca from way back. The beat was but then there were some, I guess it was the more traditional churches that didn't readily accept the the bands with that kind of music. You know, bands like Promise would have had a hard time. Phase 2 Undaunted was a band too, I remember. And they probably would have had some difficulty, the Gospel Comforters getting accepted into some churches, right? But that was basically the norm. I don't think they would have had that difficulty in the Pentecostal, you know, and non-conformist type churches, because they sang like that as a congregation, you know. Yeah, New Testament church was always that kind of. For all I remember, from as long as I can remember, that was always the kind of rhythm and beat. Of course, they still had a kind of church sound, all right. So you could tell that you were in church, but the, you know, tambourines beating, and you always had that kind of up-tempo movement and music going in those churches. Well, you know, it's with things that are different. People tend to not readily accept things that appear different, and because it sounded so much like calypso, right? You know. Well, I don't know if you had that problem growing up. If you started to sing calypso on a Sunday, your mother's house, stop singing banjo. So we all went through that phase, you know. So once it started, anything that sounded like that. And it may still be happening. Anything that sounded too much like, you know, the calypso, it was frowned upon, right? But after time, it became, you know, more accepted. And so I guess with the exodus of the older generation, and then the younger people came in, it was more accepted then. But initially, it would have had some difficulty. What seems to be absent now with the choirs, I guess things happen seasonally, so there's an era for this, that, and the other. So you don't see the choirs now proliferating like before. It could be that most people now want their individual expression. So the era now is for, you know, a soloist out there with a backing group, a small backing group. Easier to manage too, because I can tell you, when you have to deal with 60, 70, 80 people to try to bring them together and form, you know, a group and keep it together, that is not easy. So it makes much more sense now. You're supposed to have a smaller group that you can handle. Getting rehearsals done and so on will be much, much easier. So that is what we're seeing now. We're seeing more individuals out there. And they put out their music, and you know, they'll have a small group behind them.
It is generally accepted that the late 1980s, early 1990s saw a decline in the number of gospel concerts and other gospel events or activities. Shelton gives us his perspective on this.
The concerts, because they were choirs with large numbers, right, they obviously then attracted the large numbers from their churches, so you could get a concert full of people, because, you know, 3 choirs would bring a whole lot of people. I don't know if that may be the reason now, or up to before COVID, they were still seeing a fair amount of activity, right? Of course, now with social media, a lot of things are done differently, and face-to-face behavior is not as prevalent as before. One of the reasons might be that it was somewhere to go, and now people don't need to go out as much because they can see everything on their YouTube or on their TV. We can get it live, so there's probably not that desire to be out on a Saturday night. Because for us then in the 80s, I mean, that was the thing to do. If you know, you get to go out on a Saturday night to a concert as a Christian person. Who wouldn't be going to fetes, and so that was your outlet to go and socialize, have fellowship, and enjoy good music as well at the same time, you know.
Well, there is good news. A festival of events emerged in Barbados. This festival affords Barbadians and visitors the opportunity to engage in those many wonderful expressions of gospel which they enjoyed decades ago, and to keep that gospel experience alive and well in Barbados. Executive producer of Barbados Gospel Fest, Adrian Agard, takes us back 30 years ago as we learn of the establishment of the festival.
Barbados Gospel Fest is a collection of events that seek to glorify God, communicate the gospel, bring people together in an atmosphere of worship, from not just here in Barbados, from across the world really. How did the festival come about? One would have to go back to the circumstances that existed in Barbados in 1993, when there was a lot of discussion around casino gambling and such. And the Minister of Tourism at that time was now Sir Wes Hall. And his desire at the time was to create an event around the theme that he called wholesome tourism, to seek to bring people to the island in what was a kind of shoulder period for tourism in the month, around the month of May. And brought together a committee of people at the Barbados Tourism Authority, as it was then, to discuss this concept. And I was involved in radio and involved in promoting events and such like at the time, and I was invited to sit on that committee just as part of the committee. There were quite a number of persons involved in that planning of the first festival. When I think back on it, I remember the first night at the Garfield Sobers Gymnasium, and Gospel Fest happened to be on the first major event that took place at the Garfield Sobers Gymnasium soon after it was opened. I remember saying to Hugh Riley, who later became the head of the Caribbean Tourism Organization, he was then an officer at the Barbados Tourism Authority, I said, Hugh, in effect, this is really a Bobby Jones show, an North American television show recorded in Barbados. And he said, well, yes. So it was 3 nights of events, Friday, Saturday and Sunday at the Garfield Sobers Gymnasium. An arrangement had been struck with Dr. Bobby Jones, who was then very much associated with the BET. And he was the one who spearheaded the coordination of the talent and so forth, and effectively recorded a production for North American television. That was the first festival, and the second one in 1994. Things that happened in Barbados impacted the festival. Many people remember 1994, what happened in Barbados in 1994. There was a no confidence motion against the government. The Riskin Sandiford administration lost the election, and the Owen Arthur administration took over the leadership of Barbados. And those people who were then appointed to the Barbados Tourism Authority had a different perspective on what should happen with the production of an event. They did not see the authority as the body that should be charged with that responsibility of producing a festival or an event like that. Though they pledged support to it, the chairman, then Erlin Schaffler, met with a group of us and asked me to chair a group of persons from the Christian community who would coordinate the festival for that year, and with the hopefully at that time we were talking about for that year and beyond. So I accepted that responsibility. At the time, not realizing that acceptance of that responsibility also meant accepting responsibility for losses and so forth that would occur in the coming festivals, and so started at my journey of responsibility for the festival. After 1995, which was the main year that they give support to the festival, coming into 1996, I heard rumblings that someone at the BTA was contemplating, or the term, killing the festival. Okay, we're not going to bother with this anymore, kind of thing. I said to the people I was working with at the time But if we feel that this festival is of some value to Barbados, we have to be prepared to and be committed to producing it, whether the Barbados Tourism Authority supports it or not. And a few years, I think about 96 or 97, then that support kind of disappeared. But the commitment which I made and which I had with my team, we determined we would continue to produce the festival. And we produced it through some rather challenging years. And more, I got the clear understanding that somebody had to take full responsibility for it. Myself and my wife were the two people who were making contact with people, booking venues and so forth. If you go out like that and you make commitments to people, and this is a Christian event we are doing, you better be able to honor those commitments, whatever it took. And it took a lot of effort to honor the commitments when the audiences didn't turn up in the way that you expected. The results in terms of revenue was not there. The support financial from various quarters was not there. We took that responsibility, and by the grace of God we were able to keep things going. And it came to a point where, because you're making financial commitments, you're booking people's venues and you're engaging people for hire, it was felt that we needed to move it from just a name, Barbados Gospel Fest, and so we incorporated as Gospel Fest Barbados Inc., and for which myself and my wife have had responsibility ever since then. As the years developed, we also, not only did we incorporate, we developed a number of different things. We did some branding. We also established with the help of some colleagues, friend of mine, Dave Weeks, who worked with his wife Marcia at Praise Academy of Dance now. I remember meeting at his home in St. Philip one Sunday afternoon, going through and discussing the vision and mission statement for the festival, and really drilling that down, and working with a guy like Mark Hill, who is now, I think, back at BIDC. He was working there at the time and assisted us in developing, coming up. He's the one who actually came up with the logo, the design of the logo. And so developing the vision and mission statement, branding the festival, beginning then to aggressively market the festival and communicate with potential sponsors. And a number of companies that took up that. One of the key ones in the early days would have been a company like Quartz that came on board. And once we started to attract that level of support, others followed, and we started to, then again, we were back in a situation where we were able to generate and attract the interest of the Barbados Tourism Authority again to the festival. And that support has been pretty consistent and solid over the years subsequent to that. But it took us developing something that, and a brand that became, I believe, attractive to some of the sponsors here. Just over the past few days, I had the experience of interacting with a family from Florida. They were here to commemorate their sister, who was attracted to the festival, came to Barbados. She was a part of our team, she became a part of our intercessory team. And her wish before she passed away, was that her ashes be scattered on the ocean in Barbados. Now this is years later, because Crystal first came to Barbados, I believe about 2012, passed away I think around 2020. And 10 members of her family booked their travel to Barbados, stayed at the Hilton Hotel, just to honor her memory. And based on our interactions with them, pledged to be back the next time we staged the festival. I could point to groups out of Washington, across the United States, out of England, out of the UK. There's so many people who have visited the festival. The theme which we developed for the festival, out of the whole interaction, was touching lives, changing nations. We found that people came and had a beautiful experience with the festival. So I think that we've had some impact in the area of tourism. We've done lots of work working with people like Seymour Bailey of the Barbados Tourism Marketing. He's now based in Miami, doing promotional trips to just to promote the festival in various areas. As a matter of fact, it's out of that interaction with Seymour and the Barbados Tourism Authority that one of the really wonderful events of the festival emerged, an event which was unique in its nature, event called Laughter and Jazz. That came out of a promotion and some activity that Seymour was doing in Miami, in the Miami area, and where a competition was run for comedians. And I was presented with this challenge. Okay, so we're going to have whoever won the competition, maybe out of the first three places, we want to bring these people to the festival. So we are faced as a committee to determine what we're going to present. We've never done any jazz event or any comedy event. And we came up with this concept called Laughter and Jazz. And we started at the Divi Hotel in their restaurant. They have a little stage area there the first year. Second year was also held there. And by the last year that we did that event at the Divi, we were using almost a complete lawn in terms of the way that event moved. We've seen a number of the comedians coming out of the United States. Some of our local people have also had a part to be involved, and the musicianship has always been mostly, a lot of it has been Barbadian, but we have had other artists coming in, and it's one of the, I would say, one of the flagship events of the festival, and that came directly out of interaction with the Barbados Tourism Marketing and the work they're doing in the United States and so forth.
Beyond tourism, Gospel Fest has been key in introducing individuals to gospel and sharing it across the island. What was the national impact of this exercise? Shelton Perkins reveals.
Well, there's nothing like the word, right, and the gospel to bring people an understanding of what God can do, and then what music can do, because you know people may go to a concert who may not go to church, right? And you can hear the word and receive the word through music. Sometimes the more powerful way than through spoken. So that influence is there, and also because you're out there, so you're out there to reach people, and you're not inside of the walls of the church. So you keep a concert or something in the outdoors. If you do Farley Hill, for example, people will come, maybe just come into line, but then they will get the gospel, right? And that makes a difference in people's lives. You may not see a big total transformation straight away, a global transformation in the thing, but you will see individual lives that were changed, and people will tell you and testify about, you know, how these things have helped them. They went to a concert, somebody invited them, but then, you know, they were able to see that, you know, this thing is making sense, and my life turned around because of it, right? And so, as it happens in small individuals, among individuals, they obviously have an overall impact on the country and the society, and those things have to continue to happen so that we can keep a foundation, you know, and a balance as far as the spiritual side of people's lives, because you know you need that. Your life is not just physical and mental and social. It has a spiritual component which has to be catered to, and so we have to continue to cater to that spiritual side, and not necessarily by expecting people to come to church, but going to them. So a festival like Gospel Fest is just as critical as crop over, right? in my view.
I always step away from this idea of calling nations Christian nations, because that can be problematic for some people. But what I think festivals that, like the Barbados Gospel Fest, the impact that they have is that for 1 week in May, for the last 30 years, everybody from North Point in St. Lucie to, let me see how well I remember my Barbados geography, whatever the most, to Oistins. From St. Lucie to Oistins. There is a consciousness in the minds of everyone that the gospel is being proclaimed. Now, it is being proclaimed within a context where, yes, there are people of other faiths. We may even say there are people of no faith. But for 1 week, a nation receives as many different expressions of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And why this is important is that it brings us back to Jesus' teaching when he called his first disciples and he says, I am calling you to fish for people. Now, I mean, we're here at the sea. I have never fished in the ocean. But as a child growing up in Antigua, we had pond. And so that was where I did my fishing. And we used to go and dig for worms and put them on the hook. And one of the things you learn very early when you are fishing is making sure you have the right bait. And with the bait, you then know that the possibility of catching fish increases. I do remember instances of throwing over a hook with nothing on it, you know. And of course, if you don't have a bait, don't expect anything. But beyond that, it is also knowing how to fish and what bait is used. And not only what bait is used, how do you patiently cast a line? And so, to answer your question very directly, the nation of Barbados, for this week, as it is hearing the gospel, I think then of the whole nation experiencing a fishing opportunity in which it may be at Hymn Speak, it may be at Laughter and Jazz, it may be at Farley Hill, it may be, well, it's not at the gymnasium anymore, it may be at another location. Somewhere in all of these interactions, someone may hear something that will have them say, huh. And how do you just pause? Just pause for a moment and think about maybe where you're at in life and think about what needs change. What do you celebrate? And I think by virtue of this constant movement for 7 days of the gospel of Christ being done in places that you don't normally, so on Farley Hill, you know, at a poolside for Laughter and Jazz, in spaces where you don't normally expect that kind of an interaction to happen, then you may not catch a fish, but you've certainly put the bait out. And if the bait goes out, it is probably this year or next year or somewhere down the road, someone may say, you know, I still remember that moment during a gospel fest when something that was said ministered to me. So festivals like the Barbados Gospel Fest are critical to a nation that is seeking to be in touch with, if you want to call it, its spiritual grounding. And even while it may not necessarily be a Christian nation, thankfully, the gospel of Christ is still being able to be proclaimed. And we dare not take that for granted.
No, we must not take opportunities like this for granted. Touching lives, changing nations. The series continues next week at the same time.